webinar and thank our panelists, Kai Salem, Camilo Viveros, and Leah Bamberger. Really a dream team. When I was asked by Eben Goodstein, who you just heard, who I would like to have come and talk, and I've talked about this with Dawn King, who's also on the call from here at Brown, at the Institute of Brown for Environment and Society. She agreed that these were three people that would bring together issues of sort of the technical expertise on what's going on legislatively and in terms of state policies and city policies, but then also the people who have brought together the issues of justice and climate change right here at home. And that is, I would argue, I've learned over these now 30 years I've been working on climate change, that we're not going to resolve the problem without also addressing issues of equity and justice. So that's going to be really a core of our discussion. I mean, we have an urgent problem, but we have to deal with it in a way that is just and inclusive, both in terms of the outcomes and the process. And really, I think Leah Bamberger has, as the sustainability director of the city of Providence, led a process that's path-breaking and is probably one of the best in the country in terms of equity and inclusiveness and in its process. So we're going to hear all about that. The reality of climate change in Rhode Island, you all are probably on this call because you know how bad it is. We have 400 miles of coastline that is extremely vulnerable. We have vulnerability to heat, to flooding. We have air quality issues and asthma, and the list goes on and on. And yet we have some progress in the state, and we'll hear from Kai Salem from Green Energy Consumers Alliance about where we are in the state. What are our policies? Are they relatively good, or are they relatively outdated, or are they enough to really deal with the problem of climate change? We have issues right now where we have a legislative session that's probably over. It's very unlikely that they're going to come back into session. Another year, therefore, has been lost to progress in terms of binding legislation in our state to address the climate crisis, which is very frustrating. We're in an election year. It's, as Iban interestingly said in that video, you know, the best thing you can do as a young person is work for a campaign. We'll have some time to discuss that. And I do think that he's right on, that that's going to make a huge difference. And it may be the only way that we make the kind of difference that we need. There's much more that I could say. I think I'd like to hand it over to our panel. And then we'll have time for discussion at the end. I've asked each of the panelists to talk for 10 minutes. This should go pretty quickly. And then you all cannot unmute yourselves, hopefully. You'll have to raise your hands. There's a little feature down at the bottom. And then I will deputize Dawn King as well, who's now up here. And when I have a second, I will deputize her as a co-host, and she can help with calling on people when that moment comes. So Kai Salem is at Green Energy Consumers Alliance. She was an undergraduate here at Brown in our environmental studies program and wrote a stunning senior honors thesis about energy policy and climate policy in Rhode Island. And I think today, really in just like 2 years out there, is the top expert, or one of the few top experts on where we are in terms of climate policy in Rhode Island. So thank you, Kai, for coming. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Timmons, and thank you for organizing the panel and also for getting me my start on Rhode Island climate policy in many ways. I'm going to try to share my screen so that I can advance the slides, so I'll take a second to do that. All right, can you all let me know if you can see these? Maybe Timmons?
Looks good, yeah.
Great, then I'll get started. So my name is Kai Salem. I am currently a policy coordinator at Green Energy Consumers Alliance. I've been in this position for almost 2 years now. I'll talk a little bit about who Green Energy Consumers Alliance is, and the programs that we offer, as well as our perspective in Massachusetts, where we also work. I'll then talk a little bit about Rhode Island climate policy and policy advocacy in the state, and conclude with some ways that people can get involved. Of course, those ways have changed pretty dramatically over the past couple of weeks, but the climate crisis is not stopping, and neither are the advocates who are working on it in the state. So Green Energy Consumers Alliance is a nonprofit based in Providence, where I am right now, and in Boston, Massachusetts. We've been around since the 80s. Green Energy Consumers Alliance started as an oil buying co-op that was focused on making energy more affordable for consumers. So we are at our core a consumer-based organization. We're centered around making the energy systems work better, and in 2020, that means working to stop climate change. We recently changed our name in the past couple of years from People's Power and Light here in Rhode Island to Green Energy Consumers Alliance, which is the same name that we have in Boston, where we were formerly Mass Energy. And our mission is a little bit twofold. We aim to enable everyday people to make green energy choices, and we harness the collective power of our members to advocate for energy policy that speeds the transition to a low carbon future. So I'll start with our programs that we offer. Consumer or a small business electricity local through our Green Powered program. We're currently working, and perhaps Leah will mention this, with cities across Massachusetts and Rhode Island to bring that green power to communities at scale through green municipal aggregation. We have a program that allows our members to test drive electric vehicles, learn more about electric vehicles, and then get discounts on those cars with dealers that we partner with. We have a program that we run in the summer that's all about greening the grid by helping you use less electricity when that matters the most. And finally, we have a strong advocacy program in both Massachusetts and Rhode Island, where we work to lower carbon emissions in our states through policy and program work. This is a picture to demonstrate some of the results of our green powered and our electric vehicle program. That's actually my dad in a car that he bought through our green powered program. That is a Chevy Bolt. It's an all electric vehicle, and it is powered with the electricity from those wind turbines in the back, which Green Energy Consumers buys electricity from those same wind turbines for our green powered program. And now I'll get on to our policy work. So Green Energy Consumers focuses our advocacy on practical, cost-effective policy interventions that will lead to real emissions reductions. We're focused on climate mitigation, which means reducing emissions, although we of course recognize the importance of adaptation and resilience. I think this crisis has really revealed the importance of having community resilience when things in the outside world are getting more challenging. So our work, and I'll move into this when I talk about Rhode Island climate policy and what we need to reduce emissions here in Rhode Island, is centered around advancing vehicle and building electrification, strengthening energy efficiency, which is the most cost-effective way to reduce emissions, stopping greenhouse gas pollution, lowering our greenhouse gas pollution overall, and modernizing the electric grid and our other energy systems so that it can handle the clean energy technology we need. I'll start now with talking a little bit about what we're looking at with the Rhode Island political landscape. So Rhode Island, as we all know, is sometimes called the bluest state in the country. What I found when I was doing my thesis research that Tim has mentioned was that Rhode Island is also one of the least polarized states in the country, which means that our Democrats often act like Republicans and our Republicans are almost non-existent. Everyone in Rhode Island knows that you can't get elected if you're a Republican, so almost regardless of your platform, you're running as a Democrat. That means that we have a Speaker of the House who is anti-choice, is pro-gun, and as we learned this past January with a very public series of comments, believes that Rhode Island can't and shouldn't do anything to act on climate. This policy landscape sets the tone for a lot of what we've seen so far. Rhode Island currently is one of the few New England states, few Northeast states to have non-mandatory carbon emissions targets, and we're behind on those targets. We are not on track to reducing our emissions in line with what the law says or even and certainly not even close to what science says we need to reduce emissions in a just way. And although polling demonstrates that Rhode Islanders understand the climate crisis and want to see climate action, state leaders do not believe that they have the obligation to act. The General Assembly has not passed any meaningful energy or climate legislation in over 2 years. And although the governor does talk a pretty big game on climate, you all might recall that she passed what has been referred to as the 100% Renewable Energy Executive Order this past January from Green Energy Consumers Alliance. A lot of what she has done so far has amounted to setting targets that we're not going to meet, starting plans that we're not going to implement, and we haven't seen a lot of real action that is resulting in emissions reductions in the short term. This too small to act mindset is a big barrier to overcome when we're thinking about doing climate policy advocacy. So where are we on climate today? The most recent numbers on what our greenhouse gas emissions are from the 2016, or this past December, which has the greenhouse gas emissions inventory from 2016. Simmons has done some great research demonstrating why these numbers could be off, but this is what we have from the state. What we see is that although what we often think about solar and wind as being the key to clean energy, actually the vast majority of our emissions are coming from our natural gas and oil heated thermal sectors. That's heating, water heating, space heating, as well as the transportation, the cars, buses, trains, and other vehicles that get us to and from. And that is why it is one of Green Energy Consumers' foremost priorities to focus on moving transportation and heating away from energy systems that can never be green. That's gas, oil, natural, focusing on electrifying the transportation and thermal sectors so that electric vehicles and electric heating systems, high efficiency electric heat pumps, can run on the electricity that comes from wind and solar and other renewable sources. But that's a big challenge, and we are pretty far off from meeting these greenhouse gas emissions reductions targets. These are the targets that were set in 2014 by Resilient Rhode Island. We had a lot of hope that that act would result in meaningful action on climate change. We have not seen that meaningful action, and that's why one of our policy priorities, and the policy priority of the environmental community overall right now, is to create mandatory enforceable carbon emissions reductions targets so that we can start holding our government accountable to climate action. Rhode Island, despite all of this, does have some amount of climate policy in place. Over the next couple of slides, I list the policies and programs that we do have. I won't go over them all in detail, but I'll pick a few out, and I think that this will be recorded and the slides will be shared so that you can review them or ask me questions later. Some of the most important ones in the electricity sector, which is the sector in which we've done the most to reduce emissions, include the Renewable Energy Standard. The Renewable Energy Standard mandates a rising percentage of our electricity mix that must come from renewable sources. The current standard would bring us up to 38.5% renewable electricity in 2035. And please note that that is a whole lot less than the 100% order that Governor Raimondo announced back in January. The best way we predict to meet that executive order would be by raising the renewable energy standard to 100% by 2030. And there is a bill in this session, although we don't know what's going to happen this session, that would do that. I also always like to mention energy efficiency, because energy efficiency has been a major program behind why Rhode Island's emissions have actually dropped over the past couple decades. We have some of the best energy efficiency programs in the country. Energy efficiency is climate action that saves consumers money, and we need to be investing a whole lot more in energy efficiency than we are now.
Can you wrap it up in a minute or two?
Absolutely. As far as transportation goes, we have a lot less programs. Here are some of the ones we do have and that we're working on. We'd like to do a lot more on that in the coming years. And similarly on heating, we just don't have very many programs in the heating sector, and we need to work on that in the coming years. But the policy that will underlie all of these things, we believe, is getting those mandatory carbon emissions reductions targets. so that the government starts to act and starts to invest in these programs that can help all Rhode Islanders grow green jobs and more. So how do we get Rhode Island back on track? In Green Energy Consumers, we believe that we need to collectively demand meaningful climate action, and we need to broaden the tent of people who are doing so. It is clear that our state leaders don't believe that they have a duty to act on climate, but we know that they do. And every Rhode Islander, especially the Rhode Islanders who are already most vulnerable because of race, income status, and all sorts of other inequities. So we have been working with many other stakeholders on the Climate Crisis Campaign. The Climate Crisis Campaign is a new project that is bringing together a much broader array of stakeholders. Really happy to see that the city of Providence, which Leah is speaking from today, signed on to the campaign. There's a bunch of other groups. And the Climate Crisis Campaign is allowing Rhode Islanders to mobilize on climate, get together on this. Unfortunately, over the last couple of weeks, our strategy has really deeply changed. But what we believe that this means is that we're going to take a step back and do more of that movement building and bridge building. In the next couple of weeks, we'll have a climate advocate training where we talk to Climate Crisis Campaign members about how they can work to join this movement and do remote climate advocacy while we are not able to go to the State House. So definitely visit riclimatecrisis.org and join the campaign there to get notified about events like that. And hopefully soon we'll be able to move that movement towards mobilizing for the Act on Climate legislation and other policy over the next couple of years.
Kai, thank you so much. That was great and really nicely done with the sweeping review of the different areas, especially under such time constraints. So thank you. And Kai really has been a leader of this climate crisis campaign. And I think it's been pretty remarkable to see the groups coming together around one goal, which is mandatory binding targets for the state, revising this law we passed in 2014, the Resilient Rhode Island Act. So next we're going to hear from Camilo Viveros, who's at the George Wiley Center. And Camilo has been a leader for like 30 years in sort of community organizing and connecting issues of poverty and racism and climate change and environment. So I really wanted him to be on here, and I'm just thrilled. Thank you, Camilo. It's been a pleasure working with you on a number of issues. Camilo is from Fall River, a son of Portuguese immigrants, and he has a bachelor's in sociology at UMass Dartmouth. I didn't know that. Camilo, take it away.
So I wanted to start by recognizing at the George Wiley Center, what we try to do is build participation among communities of color, low-income households, and I wanted to recognize one of our volunteer organizers that went through a job training program. I'm not sure if folks can see, she's doing much better, but she became positive in COVID-19. And this is a picture of May Marrow. So I wanted to really, a lot of you might have seen her at former protests in the past. And her story kind of illustrates the leadership that is out there. So May worked as an organizer at the George Wiley Center and has got a job as a PCA, frontline healthcare worker. One of her clients became positive, and she contracted the virus from them. But she's an example of somebody who really our economy needs to shift toward, right? And this is part and parcel of our discussion right now. So May, when her son was shot and became paralyzed, she moved into a handicap accessible apartment, brought him in, right? She was doing day-to-day work, caring for mostly disabled people of color, right, as a PCA. And she, if you've heard from her before, she's been on the front lines fighting for a percentage income payment plan as an organizer with the George Wiley Center. And, this crisis has really dispelled some of the myths that we have allowed to stunt our organizing and stunt our vision and really self defeat our own demands, right? So we no longer see these myths about the government being broke, having no money, right? The idea that the market in itself is going to solve all of our problems has kind of evaporated, right, with this health crisis at hand. But we also know if we're not organized, that there's already gearing up and folks at the George Wiley Center are already calling, trying to get unemployment assistance, fearing utility shutoffs when the moratorium is scheduled to end, right? Fearing evictions. Despite some of the movement in the political arena, we know if we're not organized to put forward our demands right now for a regenerative, a restorative, a caring economy, that they're gonna double down on us. They're gonna intensify white supremacy, right? We know when we're talking about mass unemployment, that in communities of color, it can be upward to, double, right? 50% amongst, Black youth, Black males, right? So we need to push forward a narrative and push forward our demands to make sure that we do not concede, that after this moment, we go back to business as usual, that allows them to sideline our issues, to play divide and conquer. We're at a moment that we need to make sure we demand restorative economy where women are paid equally, where care workers are valued and paid well, right? And we're seeing reactions, right? Not just by the George Wiley Center, but really unprecedented actions right now from the labor movement. Some of you might have seen that GE workers, for example, in Lowell, that traditionally have worked, their employment's been based on the war economy. They demanded that they work on building, making medical equipment, right? So we're at this moment that we can really demand new priorities, and they have to be centered on dealing with all the crises, with the intensification of inequality, with white supremacy, with climate, and I think we're in that moment. Just in the last couple weeks, some of the national alliances that we've been in working with at the George Wiley Center have started to include regenerative economy demands into our initially more narrow service demands. So, for example, a letter from 2 weeks ago that was demanding a moratorium on utility shutoffs this week has once again be submitted to the Congress, demanding also investment in regenerative energy sources and looking at decentralization of the utility sector, right? We had the people's bailout demands, which included a regenerative economy. So these demands are great, and all of us probably have signed on to multiple sign-on letters and calls, but the question is about our capacity moving forward and our ability to be creative in this moment, right? And it's going to be a learning curve for all of us, including at the George Wiley Center, right? If you're not familiar, George Wiley was a founder of the National Welfare Rights Organization. He's from Rhode Island. We relied on face-to-face Wednesday meetings to educate people about their rights and utilities, right, to organize, to plan organizing. And a lot of our members are really deep in the digital divide. And so, we have that challenge to face. On the other hand, we used to have a weekly food distribution where groups like Food Not Bombs would connect with farmers in Rhode Island and bring food to the George Wiley Center for our low-income members. And, that's transformed into a weekly distribution program where mutual aid groups from around the state are coming and helping us to distribute door-to-door food to people's households, right? So it's a moment of challenging issues that are going to turn, you know, already dangerous conditions of living in poverty for people of color and low-income households into more deadly situations. But it's also a moment where we can build solidarity by really connecting with, right, folks that are looking to build that kind of society. And we're seeing very quickly, right, these prefigurative demands that maybe a few months ago people would have said are unrealistic. So, for example, right, the guaranteed income, which was a demand of the National Welfare Rights Organization and the original Poor People's Campaign, now we're seeing, you know, okay, $1,200, it's not enough, and we can't let it be the end of it. But there's nothing that can stop us from saying, yes, you've done this for this instance, but you've proven that we can demand this, right? We can demand a guaranteed income. We can demand not just a freeze on rents and mortgages and student debt, but actually a forgiveness, because we have to come up with our plans for the economy that we think will work for the climate, for workers, for communities. And we kind of have to throw out our self-limiting impulse, right? Where every time we submit something, they say, who's going to pay for it? We see very clearly that what the government pays for is based on the priorities that are situational. So, you know, I'm looking forward to learning together how we can adapt in this moment of social isolation. We can pair up. So, for example, at the George Wiley Center, you know, a lot of our members still rely on phone banking, right? And we're hoping we can bring more into the digital divide. But we need solidarity with folks who have had the privilege and skills to do that. And we can't stop organizing. We can't allow for them to think that because we can't meet in large numbers face to face that we should concede action. We simply can't afford to do that. So, for example, in the state of Rhode Island, you know, we continue to make demands, even though our legislator hasn't reconvened on the administrative level, right? So the Rhode Island Public Utilities Commission has the authority to actually dictate to utilities lower payment plans, right? A moratorium on utility shutoffs. Also, they have the power to dictate restorations, right? And utility corporations have the ability to voluntarily agree with these, right? So we have to adapt quickly in this moment and put out our demands and react to our gains. So, for example, in Rhode Island, what that's looked like is National Grid agreed to a moratorium on utility shutoffs until the end of April. The Public Utilities Commission agreed to expand the winter moratorium for all protected categories until April 15th, right? But we need to demand more in this moment. We need to get out of the mindset where we're limiting the possibilities going forward, because if we don't step into this movement moment by demanding larger investment, larger regulation, and push back against the real dangerous attempts to wind back on things like fuel emission standards, attacks on environmental protections that adversely affect low-income communities and communities of color the most, right? So I'm gonna post a couple action steps that people can do. Like I said, there's right now in motion at the Public Utilities Commission, we're asking them to demand restoration of all utilities, right, for low-income households. We've seen this happen in other states around water, and these demands that just a few weeks ago, the George Wiley Center was kind of in the minority of demanding. Now we have thousands of people signing on to letters nationally. So I think, you know, this kind of convening where we're able to talk and strategize together is essential. Figuring out where our strengths are, where we can collaborate and build solidarity moving forward. And we're going to try to have a digital meeting on Wednesday that people will be welcome to. If people are interested in connecting to low-income and communities of color, we need help at the George Wiley Center, calling people, checking in on their well-being, and also asking them to take action around submitting comments to the Public Utilities Commission to demand the immediate implementation of a percentage income payment plan, emergency restoration of all low-income households and unemployed households, and also a permanent moratorium on low-income and unemployed households. But thank you everybody that's listening. We look forward to continuing this conversation and working together to make sure that we don't put our movements on pause, but in some ways we have to speed up our demands in this moment.
Yeah, thanks, Camilo. Really appreciate it. And indeed, it's like such a troubling time for people who are in marginal, like surviving on the edge in this pretty brutal, savage society we live in, where there's really not a safety net. I mean, this is just, we're seeing what happens. The sort of the disasters reveal what laid, out of the view of some of us. Leah Bamberger, I'm going to hand it over to you. She's the head of the City of Providence Sustainability Office. She was at Boston before, where she led their development of a climate plan in 2014, the Climate Action Plan. And she's going to talk about the amazing work they did and have been doing and are still doing here in Providence to develop a really revolutionary climate justice plan. Thanks, Leah, for being with us.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Okay.
We're seeing the slide sorter view right now.
Yeah, I think it's working on it. There we go.
Chug, chug, chug.
All right. Well, as it's catching up, thank you, Timmons, for putting this together and inviting me. It's great to hear from the other panelists and all really important parts of this work. And the intro video as well. I think it is a great moment to stop and think about, listening to the science, right? That's really important. But it's also really important to listen to and value lived experience. And those voices are often the voices that get left out. And that's part of what we really tried to avoid when we developed our climate justice plan, which was released in the fall. So I'm going to spend a lot of time just on the process. There's lots of good action items and strategies in the plan. Many align with what both the previous speakers have been talking about. So I encourage you to dive in more detail and see what's in the plan online. But I'll just kind of start by talking about our process and how we got here. First, I want to recognize that all of this work was a huge collaborative effort, and I learned so much throughout this process from our community partners, specifically the Racial and Environmental Justice Committee. This is a much better presentation when they're able to share their perspective, as well as you can imagine. It's very different from my perspective in city government, and they have so much expertise to share. But I'll do my best to at least share my journey in this work. But just to really kind of start at the very beginning, I mean, one of the exciting things I think about doing this work here in Providence is that, we really were the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution, right? And just up the road in Pawtucket. And just thinking through how that part of history not only shaped our landscape, it had a huge impact on our economy, our culture, displacing Native people. A lot of wealth was generated during this time for white settlers mainly, right? And it was done at the expense of slavery. So we were bringing up cotton from the South, spinning it into textiles and exporting it all over the world and throughout the country. So really at the root of climate change, and I'm just going to try to get through some of these slides quickly. Of course, we have the correlation with carbon emissions and the Industrial Revolution, but I think it's really important to also make the connection to slavery and the exploitation of people and humans that was absolutely necessary to creating the crisis that we have today. So
Leah, we're still only seeing the slide sorter with the first 4 slides.
okay.
It's very odd. Which is fine. They're 4
Yeah.
slides.
Well, it's going on mine here. How do I do this? Is it?
What's going on?
Are they moving?
Mm-hmm. No.
No, they're not moving. Oh, wait, now we're seeing more. No, wait, now we're on slide number 2.
Okay, so
There you go. Okay.
pictures. You're not really missing too much. I think this is where. Can you see?
Yeah, now we're seeing. Yeah.
Okay, I guess this full screen didn't work. So yeah, thinking about the connections, of course, between carbon emissions, but then, as I was saying, to slavery and the exploitation of people. And I think one of the benefits of, or what we're hoping to do with our process and the climate justice plan in centering frontline communities in the process and in the solutions is not only about bringing new voices to the table and valuing different experiences and expertise, but it's really about the outcome has been that we've really gotten at systemic and more holistic solutions. So we're not only looking at, you know, how do we eliminate carbon emissions from the electricity sector or the thermal sector, the transportation sector, but we're really thinking about how are people being treated during this process. As the video is saying, it's not just, you know, energy justice and climate justice is an important piece of this. It's not just about, you know, creating those jobs or green jobs for all, but it's making sure that we're really coming up with transformative solutions to the problem what started this problem in the beginning. So of course, Providence is particularly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. We talk a lot about sea level rise, but heat is certainly an issue that doesn't get enough attention and something that will be very problematic going forward, particularly for low-income communities of color. In this slide here, you can see more detail in the plan itself. This is straight from the plan, but just want to acknowledge that this work is building off of a long history of work that's happened in Providence and throughout the state. And we want to acknowledge that and recognize that, you know, this is a long path. And one of our ways of being that we have in this work with the Racial Environmental Justice Committee is that we're going to struggle together and that there's no quick fix. So there's often this tension we hear about when I talk about this work. It's like, oh, your process is great, but it was very long. What about the urgency of climate change? And I do believe that we actually do need to make sure we're taking the appropriate steps. And sometimes that means slowing down to make sure that everyone is included and in these processes and coming up with solutions. So part of our work we worked with the Acadia Center and did some modeling around what our emissions would look like if we did nothing going forward. And as you can imagine, not much changed. So we know we need to take drastic action if we're going to meet Mayor Lorza's goal of being carbon neutral by 2050. We also did some research looking at who are our frontline communities in Providence and how are different communities in the city experiencing impacts of climate change already. Or impacts of other environmental burdens. So the EPA EJ screening tool is a great resource, and it clearly demonstrates that our frontline communities primarily are concentrated in Olneyville and South Providence. And we worked also with the Racial Environmental Justice Committee to better understand that, you know, who are these communities, what is their makeup? And they generally include Indigenous, African American, Black, Latinx, and Southeast Asian communities. So when we talk about frontline communities, those are the communities that we're talking about. And I have a few maps that just kind of further illustrate why these are frontline communities, looking at the rate of children with asthma. Providence is already a hotspot for asthma in the state. Rhode Island has some of the highest asthma rates in the country. But then when you even dive deeper to look at the rate of asthma emergency department visits for children with asthma who are on Medicaid, so you're looking at low-income populations across the board, you still see a concentration in these neighborhoods primarily along the highways in South Providence and up into Olneyville. And then another kind of illustration of this is you look at our kindergarten age children who have elevated blood lead levels in Providence. So this is 2014 data, just showing that another environmental burden that these communities are facing is lead in their blood, mostly from environmental factors, old housing stock, contamination from our industrial legacy. So again, just connecting that industrial legacy to the current situation and recognizing that it's really, really important to acknowledge that history and understand where we're starting from and that different communities are starting at different places. So one of the principles that really guides this work is called targeted universalism. And I guess I can't really get feedback here, but many of you maybe are familiar with universal design, where you design for ADA accessibility, making sure that people in wheelchairs and other disabilities can access your building or facilities. And when you do that, you know, everyone can take a ramp, right? But not everyone can take a stairs. But so when you design for people who have disabilities or maybe have other sort of disadvantages in society, you're really constructing and designing a world that is better for everyone. And there's really no better example for this than the vegetable peeler. So the standard sort of design, the metal one on the far right, if you're looking at the screen, that was, you know, that's the sort of standard design. And the person who founded the company Oxa, which is ultimately this design, the black design on the left, came up with this design because his mother or grandmother had arthritis and she couldn't use the vegetable peeler. So he came up with this design because it was a vegetable peeler that she could use. Turns out this is a much better vegetable peeler and everyone can use it much more easily. So we take that approach when we are thinking about policy design. We often design policies and programs to reach the most amount of people, which you might think of as sort of the average person or the middle class. And when we do that, we continue to leave the folks who are most marginalized, most disenfranchised behind. The theory is that, you know, these programs or policies eventually will trickle down and will help them, but it just never does. So what we tried to do in this process is really flip it on its head, and we're going to start with coming up with solutions, programs, policies that benefit the most marginalized or our frontline communities in Providence, and then, you know, work our way in to make sure that so we can really make sure that these solutions benefit everyone. So a little bit about our process, how we did that. So first, I don't have time to really go into the whole backstory to the Racial Environmental Justice Committee, but it is a group of 10 frontline community members that are compensated to partner with the city and do this collaborative work. So they really led the engagement process. And it started with a energy democracy training and sort of just basic community organizing training. So we knew that if we were to start talking about greenhouse gas emissions in our energy system and RGGI and ISO New England, that we would lose our audience and wouldn't be able to really have a good dialogue. So we did some training and built some common understanding around how our energy system works, the nuances to it specific to Rhode Island. And from there, those folks who were trained went out and did interviews in their communities. And they asked very basic human-centered questions. So under 3 here, they asked questions: how do you keep warm in the winter? What's good about that? What would you like to change? How do you keep cool in the summer? What's good about that? What would you change? How do you get around the city? What's good? What would you change? And is there anything in your community making you sick? And we took the feedback from there, came up with a list of priorities and concerns in frontline communities, and used that to design the policies with support from the REJC and the Acadia Center, really going one by one to make sure that all of those priorities and concerns were addressed, and that the solutions were in fact equitable.
Yeah, can you try to wrap up in about a minute or two?
Yep, wrapping up here. So I would encourage you to, one of the tools we use to really communicate this work back to the communities was these future stories. They're incredible stories created by community members that illustrate if we implement this plan, how will their communities change? And it's a very powerful tool to get the word out and translate these, what can be wonky policies, into how they impact and improve people's lives. And just a few of the things going forward. Kai mentioned community choice aggregation. We are working with Good Energy and Green Energy Consumers Alliance to develop a program here in Providence, and Green Justice Zones is another program working specifically in South Providence and Olneyville to really think about how we can do more deep collaborative engagement with those communities to move the climate justice plan forward into implementation. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Leah. That's awesome. Really appreciate it. And I do encourage everybody to go find the plan. And where again can people find the plan?
Yeah, if you go to sustainpvd.com, and one of the key buttons on that first page will say climate justice plan.
Yeah, and Camilo, how can people connect with George Wiley? You're muted. We had to get a you're muted in here somewhere, so you're still muted. There, now I'll unmute you. No, I can't unmute you. Yeah, he's gonna send in the chat some links to some resources.
Right on, thanks.
There we go, now you're unmuted. Okay. So, as is so typical in these things, we're running out of time, but if there was a couple of questions, I think we should take them and then just go a few minutes late. I think to respect people's time, and maybe we'll do more of these. I mean, this wasn't so hard because we had such amazing panelists. We could make this a more regular kind of event. But so what I would ask people to do would be to put your hand up. There's a little tool somewhere. Do you see this?
It's under participants, Timon. So if you just click on manage participants, it'll pop up.
Dawn, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, all. I'm Dawn. I'm sorry, I had a meeting right before this, so I just like a couple minutes late. My name's Dawn King. I teach energy policy and food systems, and I look at the kind of interchange of both of those systems in my research and teaching. And just first of all, I just wanted to thank all three speakers. That was great. And Timmons, thanks for getting this group together. I know Kai started with talking about how we haven't had a lot of climate change movement in this state, and in years now. But it's inspiring to me to see what the city of Providence is doing, especially Leah taking the working with the Providence community on the climate justice plan, and Kai, what Green Energy Consumers Alliance is doing, and I've also worked with Camilo. So that part's inspiring because while there hasn't been a whole lot of movement at the state level, there has been a whole lot of movement in the state.
You mean in the city?
No, within the organizations in the state. So maybe not state level, but those of us in Rhode Island are making movements, and I thought it was great. I thought all three of your talks were great, and I'm happy to be a part of this. And I'm also happy to feel like if people want to chat or raise hands to field questions for you, Timmons.
Like in my seminars, I'm comfortable with silence to allow people to.
See, we have two questions already.
Okay.
Jack
Sure.
Robinson?
You're muted, Jack. Wait, let's see.
Oh, Timmons, you probably have done.
Okay, Jack, give it a go.
Thank you, Timmons. Wonderful panel. I have a question for Kai, if I might. You mentioned that you thought your organization was trying to do too many things. What exactly do you mean by that, and how would you change it if you were in charge of it?
Wow, I don't remember saying that, but we certainly do a lot of things. I think that we are lucky to have a lot of smart people working on it. There's a lot to be done when it comes to advocacy, and unfortunately, we only have one full-time person on each state working on advocacy. So getting more resources on the advocacy front is always helpful. One thing that I have found really challenging working on climate in Rhode Island is that we're one of the few states in the country that doesn't have a single full-time paid organizer around climate for the state, for state policy, which means that no one in the state, it's no one's full job to train people to go to the State House to talk about climate, to organize people, to get people working on rallies and things. And that's something that I think that all of the advocates do as part of our job, but it often falls to the end of our list. And that's why we're trying to work so hard on the Rhode Island Climate Crisis Campaign and build out its capacity to do that work. So I think the two things that I would love to see change for Rhode Island climate advocates in general is to grow our capacity to do that work, and that involves fundraising. I did have a fundraising link for green energy consumers in my slides. And also, of course, having more people join the Rhode Island Climate Crisis Campaign so that we can build out our volunteer capacity.
Thank you.
Great. I see May has a question.
Oops. Okay, now you're unmuted.
Hi. I was just wondering, for the organizations that were mentioned, I don't live in Providence, but I live in Rhode Island. I'm in South Kingstown. Can people from outside of the city still help and participate?
Leah, give it a go. And
yeah, absolutely. I think, well, one of the things in the climate justice plan we tried to do is make it very clear where action is needed and who's responsible. So, so with each strategy or action item in the plan, it will say the entities that are either responsible for implementing it or who should be involved in that, in further developing and moving that strategy forward. So a lot of those are directed at the state, and one of the action items is around those binding climate targets that Kai spoke about. So I think that's there's lots to do. Again, just keeping the pressure on the state to take action, and then also I would say organizing in your own community and getting, with your city council members or officials locally to do similar work in municipalities across the state is really, really important, especially as the state is not moving particularly aggressively on this issue.
Kai, you want to
Thank you.
just do you have a word or two on that?
Sure. Green energy consumers work is statewide. All of the state policy work is statewide. I mentioned the climate advocate training, but I'll plug that again. That's going to be happening in late April. We haven't set the date yet. If you sign up for the climate crisis campaign at riclimatecrisis.org, you will get that information. And we'll talk about ways that you can build the movement among your local community, among your circle of friends, because that's our priority right now as we wait for the General Assembly to get back up and running.
I want to call on Emma Bowden, who's here and is a Sunrise person and could talk also about youth organizing in the state. Emma, you wanted to also mention something you guys are doing following up on this event.
Yeah, so we're organizing a thing through Sunrise on Thursday evening at 6 p.m. To kind of do like a little debrief and discussion about what was shared today and how it informs organizing. So if you're a young person anywhere in the state who wants to get more involved, I can post a link to the Facebook event. We're going to have a Zoom call, and we'd love to have you.
Any reflections on how what was said today informs youth organizing on climate change? I'm putting you on the spot. Oh no, you're muted. Try it again.
Yeah, I think that it was really cool to see a lot of different theories of change from different organizations. And I think mostly what Camilo was saying around this being a really great moment to show what's possible feels really inspiring and true to me. I think that we're seeing what can happen when we recognize something as a crisis. And yeah, I'm excited to keep thinking about how to advocate for state level Green New Deal and also how to influence races and change who's in power in the State House so that we actually can get some legislation through. So yeah, Sunrise is going to be thinking about a lot of electoral work over the summer, and I'm excited to get to work on that.
So how about if we do one more, Dawn, and then we call it?
That sounds good. I think Jeff had his hand raised, but now it's not.
Jeffrey Mignon?
Yeah, I think so. Well, Timmons, here's one in the chat.
Okay.
Curious to know which members of the General Assembly you consider leaders on climate, or at least who you think you can work with. That's a good question.
That's a great question. I want to specifically call out the sponsors of the Act on Climate 2020 bill. That would be Don Oyer in the Senate, who's one of the smartest people in the General Assembly on climate and energy issues. And then Chris Blazajewski, who's the Deputy Whip in the House. He's the sponsor on the House side. In the Senate, we have a lot of great leaders, and we even have some interest from Senate leadership on working on climate. The House, not so much. The House, we've seen the leadership really marginalize climate champions. So other climate champions I'd like to mention Art Handy, Deborah Giro, Susan Donovan, Harry Cortbrand, Lauren Carson. There's a lot of fantastic leaders in the House, and I know that they have struggled to get things passed, and that's kind of why I certainly personally believe Green Energy Consumers is a 501c3 and we don't work on elections, but I personally believe that it is extremely important to do the work that Emma mentioned around elections, make sure that we can enable our climate champions to do the work that they're trying to do.
There's a link now in the chat from Emma about the sunrise debrief on Thursday. And one more question from Lisa to all three of you, and then we're going to wrap up. This is going to be the last question. How about that? Does your work include promoting regenerative agriculture, community gardening, and/or a shift to more plant-based diet? Industrialized agriculture is a big contributor to climate change, but regenerative agriculture can actually remove carbon from the atmosphere, which is unfortunately needed along with slashing our emissions.
Yeah, the Climate Justice Plan has a chapter on local and regenerative economy, which we include things like composting, circular economy, thinking about agriculture systems. There's so much potential and need for carbon drawdown, and let's make sure we have natural systems, natural solutions in place to do that work, and not rely on large scale technology or corporations to be driving that. So building those local systems so we can calculate and account for, what is our urban forest drawing down in Providence? What is our food system drawing down? And can we, is that a way to even build an economy around that and have that support local work, local jobs, and local production? So I think that is actually one area that really excites me and kind of is on something that we need a lot more research and action on. But it's a really, I think, exciting and emerging kind of area of thought.
Yeah.
Good. Yeah, Camilo.
I wanted to give
last words.
Tashare Battle a shout out. So one of our organizers and board members, Susan, started a garden in Pawtucket called the Taft Street Garden. And then Tashare Battle, who actually works at the ACI, started a project called Restorative Farm. And it's also called Roots to Empower, which focuses on folks coming out of prison to create green jobs in the community and also challenge food deserts, right? And then every Monday, that network of folks from Food Not Bombs in Providence and Pawtucket reaches out to farms across the state and tries to save produce and distribute it to folks that are in their houses because of COVID-19 or because of other issues, maybe differently abilities. So that's something we can use more volunteers reaching out to more farms and also help with deliveries and help with calling folks. But we are in little ways and in big ways trying to challenge, how these agriculture, how we, how we eat, how we get our energy. And I think this conversation is helping us come up with new ways we can support each other. So.
Great. So let's, we're losing people, which is appropriate. It's time. And let's thank our panel. Now, all of you can't clap because you're muted. Well, you can clap. But what you can also do is go down to the bottom of the screen. There's a reactions button and click those goofy looking mitts. So thank you all. You guys, awesome.
Thanks everybody. Thanks for
awesome job, you guys. There's a couple more links in the chat for some follow-on. So I'll try not to shut this off in the next minute if you want to get the information from Emma about Sunrise's electoral program in the summer, and then Climate Action Rhode Island, look into them as well from Jeffrey. So everybody take care. Great to see you.
Thank you.
Thank
We have a
you.
great community here. Let's keep it alive. Take care. Thanks again to the panelists.